Hey, Brad here from Breva Creative. So, a little bit about me. I love watercolor painting, although it's really hard for me to find the time to actually keep up with it. But it's seriously one of my favorite mediums. So, before we begin, I think it's good to give just a little bit of background about my watercolor style and a little bit of watercolor history as well. So traditionally speaking, there are two different types of schools of watercolor painting: Beaux Art Style and Plein Air method. Beaux Art Style goes something like this.
Now, Arthur, that is so uneven and so imprecise. Your gradients are always so uneven.
I'm so sorry, Professor.
You had better practice more. I want more practice out of you, or else I will beat you.
But ma'am, I haven't left this chair since our last session.
I want 8 more hours of practice before our next session.
But our next session is in 3 hours.
I don't care. I want perfection.
Okay, so maybe a twinge dramatic, but you get the idea. So yeah, lots of strict rules, structure, and mainly used for architectural renderings and other things of that nature, where classical design, proportions, and shadows played a pivotal role. So the École des Beaux-Arts was a collection of 19th century French art and architecture schools that taught watercolor methods like this. And a lot of major and important artists and architects came out of this school of thought. Delacroix, Renoir, John Singer Sargent, Degas, H.H. Richardson, and Julia Morgan, to name a few. And if you don't know who Julia Morgan is, do yourself a favor and go to Wikipedia right now and look her up, because she is amazing. Okay, this is a Beaux Art Style watercolor that I did a while back. There's a couple of giveaway signs that tell you that this is indeed a Beaux Art Style watercolor. First off, is a nice large gradiated sky. Secondly, there's usually always some sort of elaborate border and text with a serif font, architectural detailing with classical columns and a dark section poche, very intentional gradiated washes to highlight curved surfaces and give depth to the painting, and of course deep shadows, usually with the sun at a 45-degree angle. With the Beaux Art Style, you generally were limited to three different colors. You'd have a red, a yellow, and blue. Right here I have a burnt sienna, a yellow ochre, and a French ultramarine. These were basically the 3 colors that you got, and that's about it. With those three colors, you could basically make any natural, found in nature color. Think like limestone, brick, trees, sky, anything that you would need to paint a old European cathedral. The en plein air method is a little bit different and goes something like this. Samantha, what a beautiful painting you have. It's just gorgeous. In fact, everyone today did an amazing job, spectacular job today. For the assignment this weekend, we're going to go out. I want you to all go out and find a beautiful spot to rest and paint a flower. Does that sound good to y'all?
But Professor, what about the drum circle?
The drum circle! I forgot about the drum circle! Assignment canceled, postponed till next week. Hey Eva, are you sure we want to do these skit things?
No.
Of course, this is exaggerated, and both styles are equally beautiful in their own ways to me, but generally speaking, when you hear the term Beaux Art, that's generally referring to a stricter, more controlled watercolor with a focus on architecture. And when you think of en plein air, think loose landscapes, watercolor sketching, stuff like that. So here's an en plein air-ish painting that I did of a nuclear power plant. Don't ask me why, I was the weird kid in college. But you can see the sky is a lot different than the Beaux Art one, and there's less emphasis on the architecture, more emphasis on the landscape, with those happy little trees and the reflection in the water and all that stuff. Overall, it's just a lot looser and less controlled and a little bit more sketchy. Sketch-ish? You know what I mean. So yeah, as for me, I was trained in the École de Beaux Arts method and really fell in love with it. I really loved the intricate detail that you could achieve with it, and I was pretty good at it too. Then I had a class in Plein Air style, which I also loved, but I was never terribly great at it. I was okay, it was just never my forte. So all that being said, the watercolor today that I see on YouTube generally fits into a semi-Plein Air method, which is awesome. I love it. But I think there are some really valuable lessons that the Beaux Art style can teach and that can be applied to a looser type of watercolor that's kind of been lost in translation throughout the years. So I'm going to show you today how you can turn this into this. And whether you're a beginner just starting out or if you are a seasoned watercolor veteran, stick around and see my top 5 watercolor mistakes that I see done all the time and see what I do to try to avoid them in my work. Check it out. Ah yes, gravity, the thing that keeps apples falling on your head. Surprisingly, it has other uses as well. Did you know that water flows downward? You did know that? Oh, well, this is awkward. Okay, well, we can use that to our advantage with watercolor. This is a very complex concept, I know, but all you need to do is put just a small 10-degree angle underneath your work surface, and voila, your watercolor is now a lot better. What I mean by that is when you wet the paper, if you have a flat surface, the paper has a tendency to warp and cause little puddle zones. When you get those puddle zones, it leaves areas for water and pigment to settle on the paper unevenly. The same thing happens when you have like a low sloped roof in a building and your roofer doesn't lay the roofing membrane down correctly and it's not like sloped right, and you get ponding. The same thing happens in watercolor. Basically, it just leaves more pigment in certain areas and you get a real uneven layer, which in some cases you might be looking for a little bit of that, like non-uniformity. But if you're going for like a real nice clean watercolor, this is something that you'll want to do. So immediately y'all can probably tell which is the more even wash. I used a pigment that is notorious for separating and being unpredictable just to emphasize the problem. This pigment is a real pain in the butt. Can you guess what it is? This is Payne's Gray here, and the problem with Payne's Gray is that it's mainly a mixture of an iron blue and a yellow ochre. The iron blue tends to settle quickly since it's slightly heavier, and the yellow ochre stays floating in your water and pigment mixture. So they act completely differently and they have a tendency to separate. You can see that we have some dark spots and some lighter spots. Darker spots tend to be more of a bluish hue, while the lighter spots have more of a yellowish tone. The water just puddled in the dark spots and didn't in the lighter spots. Now, when we've sloped our board, just look how even that is. And all I did was put an eraser underneath my paper to tilt it a little bit, and then picked up any extra water at the bottom of the painting with my brush once I was done with it. Okay, it is officially time for the bottle painting. For this exercise, I'm kind of ignoring the fact that the bottle is actually translucent, just for the sake of simplicity. Transparent things get really complicated to paint really fast. I'm just taking a real quick mental picture of what the shadows and reflections look like here before I get started. So I'm using a 140-pound cold press paper. I have the best results with cold press, but play around with hot pressed if you haven't already. It's a completely different animal. Always, always, always start with a clear layer of just water. This preps the paper for accepting the pigment. If you don't do this, you'll probably get some splotchiness. So this first yellow layer is really just for the background and it's something I'll do on each painting. And as you can see, I'm just using my little eraser to slope the water the direction that I want it to go. If you're doing a gradient, you want the lighter portion to be elevated higher than the darker portion, or else the dark portion will seep down and get all funky. So since this is the crappy painting, I'm only going to do one light layer over the bottle, and then I'm gonna come in with some medium value shadows, and that's about it. Yeah, we can do better than that for sure. Unlike our first sad attempt, this first layer on the bottle, I'm going to do a little bit darker, and I'm going to smooth it out a little more as well. The darker the gradient gets, the more smoothing you'll have to do before it actually looks good. And watercolor is weird. It kind of has a short window of being incredibly forgiving, but then once it dries, it's more or less on there to stay. That's why you always work light to dark in watercolor. Now once that layer has dried, I'm going to flip it so that I can do another wash in the other direction. What this will do is give me a dark edge to the left side of the bottle as well, which makes total sense if your light source is hitting the front face of the bottle. If your light source was like perfectly perpendicular to the bottle, like off to the left, then it would make sense to have a lighter area on that left side. But we are not cavemen here, so our light source is where it should be, behind us and to the side. Now it's time to really punch those values. This is probably like an 80% value, and then after that it's really just a bunch of smoothing with your brush. You can use a dry brush to pick up pigment and extra water, and you can also use a damp brush to add some water back in if your watercolor is getting dry, or if you want to lighten a certain area. But really this smoothing technique just takes practice, so go practice. And yeah, it's already looking 100% better from our benchmark, but we're still gonna keep going. We're going to add another layer to the left side and then jump into the shadows from there. So we want to retain a slight highlight a little bit left of center, so we want to make sure that we're not hitting that with a lot of pigment. Once everything is reading consistently and even, we can then move into adding some nice dark shadows. Mwahaha. Everyone does shadows a little bit different, but I like to use nearly a full value pigment. I literally just wet my brush and dip it in the pigment. Sometimes you can mix in like a dark purple or a blue to give you a less warm shadow and more of a cool shadow. You also want a really nice thin brush for this with minimal frays and a really fine tip. And progress report. We are doing a whole lot better than our previous one, so let's keep going on these shadows. And while we're at it, we're gonna switch up the camera angle to give y'all a closer up shot. Yeah, that's the good stuff. Okay, so there's a lot to consider when you're laying out your shadows. You want them to look believable, but sometimes it's hard to visualize where the shadows will actually land. One thing you can do is make a photocopy of your pencil drawing and lay out your value in pencil. This helps a lot with composition because it removes the color aspect of everything and all you see is the value. It also isn't your final painting, so you can explore different options. There's no real eraser for watercolor, but there definitely is one for pencil. And there we have it. We have a pretty decent bottle here, but there is one more trick that will make this painting pop like nothing else. On to tip number 3. In order to get that glossy look that only glass has, we need to do some leave outs. Leaving white space will automatically give your painting a focal point and can really help you compositionally. You can achieve that by either using masking fluid or just by avoiding the spot that you're trying not to paint. Either way, we're going to go with the latter this time. You see we already did a layer of yellow over everything, but that's okay if your white space is a little tinted. I promise once the rest of the painting gets dark, it'll look like it's shimmering white by the end. The next few steps remain the same as the last time. Just remember to keep avoiding that leave out area with your pigment. So we're gonna skip ahead here a little bit. Boing! Now, this is just a little bit of extra credit. In the same manner that we got the curve on the bottle, we're going to do the same thing along the minor curves in the bottle, mainly around the lip. Since this surface isn't flat, it shouldn't read as a flat plane. Therefore, we need some sort of value delineation here. And there's our first one. We're gonna do one more at the very top, and that should cover us. I'm also gonna add one more step here before we get to the dark shadows. I'm gonna do a darker gradient where I'm planning on having shadows, but not the full value of the shadow. This will help the transition between shadow and non-shadow to be less harsh, and it'll also give the shadow just a little bit more depth. No major changes to this shadow step, maybe a little bit more definition and a little bit better since this is the third time I've painted this bottle today. But overall, I think this third one turned out the best, although I did screw up the proportions when I sketched it, so it's a tad bubbly, but you know, whatever. So here's where we started. Definitely some missing definition, missing a sense of space and shadows. Then the second one is good, but you don't really get that same glass-like quality without white space. Although this one did get a really nice sheen at the lighter portion that I didn't really quite get on the third one. And of course, my pride and joy, definitely miles ahead of the first one and probably a step above that second one as well. And just to compare next to our actual subject, not too shabby. I don't know about you, but when I start a new hobby, I always have the tendency to want to say to myself, well, I can paint the Sistine Chapel on my first try, right? And of course I can't. So if you're like me, just take a breather for a minute and do some watercolor exercises before jumping fully into a project. These are just some of my very first practices. They're not good. But I think it's important to show you that, yeah, you do need to do this kind of stuff in order to really hone your talent. Now, this is an awesome color reference guide that I made. I took every watercolor pigment that I had and I laid them out on a single sheet. I did a 20%, 40, 60, 80, 100% value box with a full gradient of each one next to it. I did this exercise for two reasons. It really helped me build my gradient and my staying inside the lines skills, but it also gave me a great color guide reference for when I'm trying to achieve a certain color. So this is what I mean when I say that. These two blues look pretty similar on the packaging, but when you actually look at the colors that they make, this Prussian blue makes a much more indigo color. And same thing with these. This is the same exact color by the same exact makers, but the color on the tube is completely different. So it's helpful to have this as a reference when things like this happen. And the fifth and final tip that I have for y'all today is patience. I know it's hard for me too, but I promise it'll pay off. I see a lot of beginners that try to rush the painting, and watercolor is one of those things that really likes to behave a certain way, and it takes time to learn how it likes to behave, and it takes time to learn how to coerce the water to behave in the way that you want it to. So skipping the steps like adding that first clear water layer to hydrate your paper and not letting your paper dry enough between layers can really hinder your progress as a watercolor painter. Another thing that I see a lot of watercolor painters do is not building up your paint layers organically. Now what I mean by this is a lot of people will mix their first and only layer of paint to be the color and value that they're looking for. Say if you want like a really deep shade of blue, the best way to get that vibrant color is generally not with a single layer, but it takes lots of time and patience and lots of built up layers built on top of each other. Doing it this way, you'll get a much more even disbursement of pigment, and it's a lot easier to cover up mistakes. You'll also get a really deep, rich color out of this as well. Okay, I will step off my soapbox for now, but I hope you all learned something in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had a few takeaways. And if you had any questions, comments, ideas for me, please let me know in the comments. And be sure to click that subscribe button, but please, please don't smash it. Our subscribe button is very fragile. So yeah, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.